Hi, well, I think that was my cue that we can get started. So welcome. I know we have a small group here today, and I don't know if you're students or prospective students or general public, but you're all welcome. And I know we're going to record this and distribute it beyond. So I'm going to talk about war crimes prosecutions. And oh, by the way, I'm Professor Jennifer Trahan, NYU Center for Global Affairs, and I run the concentration in the international law and human rights. I'm going to talk about war crimes prosecutions, which is somewhat my shorthand. I mean to include genocide and crimes against humanity as well. I often call these atrocity crimes, but I often war crimes, tribunals, and prosecutions is kind of is my shorthand. And this is a lecture that if any of you are my students from international law, we have covered these topics last week and this week. And then in the spring, I have an entire course called International Justice. And we look at these tribunals in that course. So if anyone's interested in that course, it's running Tuesdays at 3:30 in person. So I'm going to start with an anecdote to explain why we have these tribunals, what I'm going to be talking about. And I got this anecdote from Reed Brody. I used to work with him at Human Rights Watch. And he said, if you kill your neighbor's chicken, you owe them a chicken back. If you kill your neighbor, you get prosecuted for murder. If you torture or kill 40,000 individuals, you go into exile in the neighboring country. And that used to be the history of this field. Like, this field just didn't exist. We had mass atrocities and really very little reckoning with them. They just overwhelmed the domestic court system. So, and the need for something over and above the domestic court system became very apparent, for example, after World War I. There were proposals for an international tribunal already then, and they didn't do it. They used German courts and ended up with the Germans receiving short sentences and early releases. And basically the same happened with the Turkish genocide regarding the Armenians, tried in Turkish courts, short sentences, early releases. So it simply didn't work to use, certainly not the perpetrators' own domestic courts. So we have really the great epiphany of an international tribunal at the Nuremberg prosecutions. And I'm going to try to share a screen and show you, just for fun, a picture of the docket. This is in Nuremberg, Germany, and where they have a terrific museum about the trials. If you're traveling through, I recommend it to you. And this was really an epiphany that because until then, international law had been very much focused on states did things. Germany did something. But Nuremberg says, no, we need to prosecute individuals. And there nearly wasn't the Nuremberg trials because Stalin believed in mass executions. Even Churchill endorsed mass executions of a limited number. And FDR initially endorsed executions as well. And only kind of last minute, Henry Stimson convinced him, and Henry Morgensaw's plan for pastoralizing Germany and summary executions fell to the wayside. So there nearly wasn't Nuremberg. And I think Nuremberg is so significant because without the Nuremberg trials, I don't know that we would have had the tribunals that we've had today. And one of my favorite quotes from this is Chief Justice Robert H. Jackson, the chief prosecutor for the Americans, that four great nations, flushed with victory and stunned with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law, is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. So instead of summary executions, they decided to do trials. And of course, they weren't perfect trials. We often hear Nuremberg described as victor's justice. It was justice by the victorious allies of World War II against the vanquished, and certainly left off any kinds of crimes of the allies. So by today's standards, we would want even-handed application of justice, something we're still not always achieving today. But it was a very, very important start for the field. We also have the Tokyo Tribunal, and I can just quickly share screen to those in the docket in Tokyo, or these are the panel of judges in Tokyo, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. And this in the history books goes down as less significant than Nuremberg. I think it was seen as more one-sided. It was really US created. So we generally say the field began with Nuremberg. So, and Nuremberg very importantly established two corollary positions, that higher ups are not immune and acting under orders is not a defense. And if you don't have those two positions, you don't basically have the field of international justice. Two maybe little known facts of Nuremberg: the core prosecutions were on the crime of aggression, starting aggressive war, and the genocide, the Holocaust, was kind of a sideshow at Nuremberg. So the term genocide doesn't get coined until the 1948 Genocide Convention. It's used in passing in the indictment, but it's not one of the counts in the indictment. So the Nuremberg trials were not about the Holocaust. They were more about aggressive war, also tried war crimes and crimes against humanity. And then there were additional topical trials for instance, in the US zone of occupation. The mobile execution squads, Einsatzgruppen, is basically the SS case. The doctors, medical experimentation, the forced labor, etc., slave labor. These were the topical trials, and then the Allies had different trials as well in their occupied territories, and Germans are still prosecuting aged Nazis that they find to this day. I thought I would, in addition to talking a little bit about the tribunals, I would talk a little bit about the crimes. The crime left off at Nuremberg was genocide. And just to say, genocide is one of, so I'm a lawyer by training, and it is one of these very precise definitions. And there are all these debates in the public whether certain crimes qualify as genocide or not. And that's because there is this very specific definition. You have to have crimes committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. So it's really this, and that's kind of this overarching mental state called the dolus specialis, special mental state requirement. And it's kind of, you know, this large scale, you know, you're not getting at political opponents. So it's not, if you noted, it covers national, ethnical, racial, or religious groups. So the Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda were different ethnic groups. So killing a different ethnic group, not for political reasons, not because you want to land grab, not because you want to get even with them, but it passes all of those into, we just want to destroy the group. And you know, unfortunately, we have seen this all too often. I refer to the genocide against the Armenians, and that's a little mixing apples and oranges, because that happened in the early 1900s. We didn't yet have the term coined until 1948, but under today's standards, it would certainly qualify. You know, if we look pre-1948, we could go, you know, of course, way back in time, and probably find many genocides, and we'd probably say, you know, the genocide of the Native Americans in our country. In terms of those that have been adjudicated, certainly the Rwanda genocide, the killing at Srebrenica in Yugoslavia, and I'll talk a little bit about those tribunals. There was the certain UNFAL campaign when the Iraqi forces went into the Kurdish areas in 1988 and used chemical weapons against the civilian population. Cambodia, but for technical reasons, not the majority of the killing, but when they were targeting certain pockets of ethnic groups, because otherwise they were targeting often political and leaders and intellectuals and those who opposed the Khmer Rouge. And it was Khmer targeting Khmer, which is not what Raphael Lemkin intended when he drafted the term. And I should have said I could take Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions about this, and you can start putting them in the Q&A, I'd be happy to do that. So if you have questions about what has been or has not been adjudicated, the crimes in Darfur have not yet been adjudicated. I think they very clearly were genocide. What happened, it has been happening to the Rohingya, I think very clearly is genocide, has not yet been adjudicated. And now we have the crimes against the Uyghurs as well, which appears to me to fall within the definition. And I can take more questions on any of those if they're of interest. Crimes against humanity is kind of a large-scale attack against the civilian population with a lot of underlying crimes. And so if a crime isn't genocide, it likely is crimes against humanity. And then we have a long list of war crimes, for instance, covered in the International Criminal Court statute. So that's just a little snapshot of some of the crimes. The crime of aggression, the most recent definition, is also found in the International Criminal Court statute. It's basically starting aggressive war, but criminalizing the leaders who start the aggressive war, which was the main count at Nuremberg. But it is only a crime at the International Criminal Court, and it is very limited jurisdiction. So its addition to the International Criminal Court statute in 2017, completing the statute, it was, I think, of international legal significance, but I think it's going to be fairly hard to generate those cases. Happy to take more questions on that as well. So I mentioned Nuremberg, I mentioned Tokyo, and then the world falls into the Cold War, and there are mass atrocities, and we just don't have tribunals of this type created until 1993. And of course, 1993, we're out of the Cold War, and you could actually get things through the Security Council, and they create the Yugoslav Tribunal. And I can share my screen and give go to a picture of the Yugoslav Tribunal. There it is, sitting on the Hague, Netherlands. And when I've in the past been able to take CGA students to the Hague, Bosnia, Serbia, we have gone to this tribunal and met with its prosecutors, judges, staff, witness protection, all facets of the tribunal. So and one can often it has less happening now. There are periodically proceedings, and I've taken students to proceedings, and the International Criminal Court, we've gone in and watched proceedings as well. So the Yugoslav Tribunal was created in 1993 to try mid and top level perpetrators of the wars in the former Yugoslavia. And I won't give a complex narrative about the wars. It's something I go into in detail in my classes, but we do have atrocities basically on all sides of the war. And I think the Yugoslav Tribunal gets very high marks in trying to prosecute on all sides of the war. Now, it did at the UN, in UN circles, it gets criticized. It had very high budget, and these tribunals are often criticized. But I will say, you know, you have to create a court, and you have to create, you know, judges and prosecutors, defense, witness protection. If your tribunal's in The Hague, you've got to transport people from Yugoslavia to The Hague. The International Criminal Court is doing a lot of cases, for instance, from Eastern Congo. You've got to get your witnesses from Eastern Congo to The Hague. So there are a lot of costs, and there are a lot of, it sounds mundane, but like things like translation costs when you're just dealing with a lot of different languages. These things can add up also in doing your cross and direct examination if you're going in and out of multiple languages. So, and yet these tribunals in Yugoslavia still weren't able to do all the crimes. When you create these international tribunals, the idea is to prosecute some of our highest level perpetrators. So in the region, there are courts working in Belgrade, Serbia. There's a specialized war crimes chamber. I've taken students there. There's one in Sarajevo, Bosnia. I've taken students there. And in Croatia, I think they use the 4 largest district courts for war crimes trials. So even a tribunal isn't doing all of the cases. But the Yugoslav Tribunal did adjudicate some of our key ones. I mentioned the Srebrenica genocide, a really, really tragic situation where the UN created a safe haven. The Bosnian Muslims fled to this remote little town, had a few hundred UN peacekeepers, but then their commander was taken hostage. So they're basically not able to assist in any way. And then Serbian forces surrounded him. sorted out the men and boys from the women and girls, plus the women and girls to Croatia, and did mass executions. And when I take students to the region, we do go to Srebrenica. It's kind of a chilling place to go, but I think it's an important place to remember and to understand what happened. On a slightly more optimistic note, when I do go into the region, which I've been able to do with students in the past, in which we cover, when we're in the classroom in New York, we also cover, and sometimes with speakers from the region. I do have friends who are working on reconciliation. How do you get, neighbors who formerly hated each other to move past their ancient hatreds, and they don't have to love each other. They don't have to personally reconcile, but at least get along enough not to inflame tensions. I'll put it that way. And there are great NGOs in the region, Post-Conflict Research Center working on this, but it's kind of a one-on-one. They do like outward bounds with Bosnian, Serb, and Croat youth, and you kind of see it's a really slow process. Youth Initiative for Justice takes high school students from Republika Srpska and the Federation of Bosnia and brings them to simply meet and talk to each other and realize the other isn't evil. And they're really inspiring programs. And I like to bring in people who work on these issues. I'll just tell you a little bit about the Rwanda Tribunal. So I also, when we're not in the middle of COVID, take students to Rwanda, a separate trip. And of course, they went through an indescribably horrific genocide in 1994, killing, it's estimated around 1 million Tutsi and moderate Hutus as well, clearly adjudicated to be genocide. The tribunal created through the Security Council, and as was the Yugoslav Tribunal, and adjudicated some of the key cases. I think I have a photo from Rwanda. Well, I think this is the vote to create the tribunal. And then one of the key cases, the media case, talking about how the media can incite genocide. And this is the cover of Kangura newspaper, because they used RTLM radio and Kangura newspaper to inflame. I'll skip maybe my slides of mass atrocities. But before I discourage you from going to Rwanda, it is a lovely, wonderful country. And that is Virunga, where the mountain gorillas are. So I have taken students to see mountain gorillas and golden monkeys. And it's really a gorgeous country. And I mean, of course, the country, is never fully over the genocide, but they've, Kigali is a very rebuilt capital. So if you have images of Hotel Rwanda in your mind, that's not really the country today. I'm rapidly running out of time. I was supposed to lecture for 20 minutes, and I encourage anyone to put questions in the Q&A. You could put them in the chat. I don't see anything coming in, so I'm going to continue to talk. And we'll talk a little about the International Criminal Court. Oh, I think I have a picture of the International Criminal Court as well. So just to show what I'm talking about, there we are. And so this is a court negotiated by states, little different from our other tribunals, in that Yugoslav and Rwanda were created by the Security Council. And this one, states came together. Rome, Italy negotiated the statute. First, it had active jurisdiction over genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, but as I mentioned, now is adjudicating crime of aggression, or has the potential to do so. And it has had cases from DRC, Mali, Central African Republic. It has completed a Uganda trial, in Darfur cases coming up. Many of these, and it has investigations places such as Georgia, Ukraine, Venezuela, Israel, Palestine, Colombia, US Afghanistan case I can talk about if there's interest in that, potentially looking into US war crimes, basically torture committed in Afghanistan, although to my knowledge, that case is not currently proceeding on the front burner. I think it's made some real inroads. So I guess in my lecture, I'm talking about, spots where we've had justice, and there are a lot of spots we haven't had justice. But inroads have been made. We used to not have this field. Now we have this field. So the first case from DRC, the Lubanga case, prosecuted the use of child soldiers. And after that case, some child soldier units from CAR, from DRC, and as far away as Nepal, if you can believe that, were disbanded. And that's really what you want to see. You don't really want these prosecutions. You actually want to change behavior so you don't have commanders picking up child soldiers and using them to commit war crimes. You want to change behavior. Mali was an important case. That one I referred to all these cases are against individuals, but it was for destruction of cultural heritage in Mali. And maybe was not so much in the public consciousness. Destroying. We've seen the Bami on Buddhas blown up in Afghanistan. Palmyra more recently. But I don't know that it's on the radar screen of all the commanders, etc., and military forces that destroying cultural heritage is a war crime, and these important prosecutions can communicate that. Some of the places that we haven't had justice, we've had tribunals. I'm not gonna be able to talk about them. They're covered in my semester-long course. Cambodia Tribunal has adjudicated some of the Khmer Rouge crimes. We've had 2 specialized chambers for crimes in Kosovo. East Timor had a special tribunal. There's one in Central African Republic right now. And there's a hybrid in Sarajevo. And these were created by agreement between the country and the UN. But, some spots we haven't had justice: crimes against the Uyghurs, crimes in Myanmar, crimes in Syria, and the list could probably go on. So this is a half empty, cup half full lecture. Depends how you want to spin it, right? So the ways I've talked about how tribunals have been created, either the Security Council has created them or the country agrees to them. Well, regarding crimes against the Uyghurs in China, that's not going to pass the Security Council where China has the veto. China is not going to create a tribunal. Myanmar, that's not going to pass. Creating a tribunal is not going to pass the Security Council because of China's veto, and Myanmar is not going to consent to a tribunal. Syria, there was a proposal to refer the crimes to the International Criminal Court, vetoed by Russia. Syria is not going to consent to a tribunal. So even though we've made tremendous inroads, we still have a tremendous way to go in this field. I'm still looking if there are going to be questions coming in. I could pick on one of my current students who I know is on this, but I won't do that. I guess I'll tell you a little bit about my spring course. So I have this course, International Justice, and I kind of did a little snapshot of it. And we go into detail: Nuremberg and Tokyo prosecutions, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, ICC. And I'm able to sometimes bring in speakers because I've traveled to many of these places. And I'm often in The Hague working with International Criminal Court officials. I was in a meeting with the International Criminal Court just this morning, early this morning, because it's Hague time. So I can often supplement our courses, bringing in interesting speakers. When COVID's not there, we will travel again to these locations. I see a Q&A coming in. If I could talk about Duterte's war on drugs and the possibility of a case in The Hague, I think it's more than a possibility. Thank you, Christine. So that had been at the lower level preliminary examination stage. The new prosecutor, Karim Khan, recently announced it and moved to the higher level investigation stage. So there's just an open investigation. And for anyone who doesn't know, it's basically Duterte's policy that we'll just machine gun drug dealers, anyone suspected of being drug dealer, anyone kind of caught in the crossfire, and that's how we'll deal with the drug problem in the Philippines. Mass executions, without doing trials, without using arrests, etc., that's a crime against humanity. And he announced that was Philippines' policy, basically in open media. That investigation is moving forward, somewhat complicated by when the first prosecutor, Foxley Bensouda, said she was looking at Duterte's crimes, the Philippines withdrew from the court statute. So I think it complicates it. The Philippines is supposed to still cooperate with the court because they owed a cooperation obligation from having joined before. But if they now have pulled out, I'm not sure they're going to cooperate. Just seeing in the news, we have a Marcos Duterte ticket, I think, running, and these aren't the original, but children, the next generation. If you have continuity of power in the Philippines, the prosecutor is going to have trouble investigating, bringing that case. But he's trying to do it. We have a new prosecutor, Karim Khan from the UK. He was previously compiling crime evidence of ISIL crimes in Iraq through the mechanism known as UNITAD. So he's a seasoned prosecutor. So we'll see where it gets. I have another question. Could you please provide some insight about the recent announcement of the ICC about conducting investigations in Venezuela? What's the likelihood of success? Likelihood of success. Now that's a hard one. So the prosecutor has been looking at crimes in Venezuela. And by the way, the prosecutor always would look at crimes in the whole situation country. They don't just say, okay, we're going to look at government crimes, but they would say, we're going to look at government and opposition and any crimes in the situation. It's really one of the things the ICC does. The tribunals have tried to. Doesn't always happen, but it's really what you want to see. So there is an investigation open as well regarding Venezuela. And here I was a little bit surprised because the prosecutor recently was received by the government in Venezuela. So I actually might have calculated that Venezuela would just say, we're not giving you a visa, you're not getting into our country, you can't investigate, etc. They let the prosecutor in. So that is very interesting. So it looks a little more, possible. And then it doesn't always mean there will be a case. One of the possibilities under the International Criminal Court is they just can't prosecute all the crimes globally. There are just so many atrocity crimes. So what they actually do is give first bite of the apple to the national country. So if the national country conducts investigations or prosecutions, then the ICC won't. So it actually would, and this has been happening somewhat in Colombia. So if Venezuela does some accountability, then there wouldn't be a Venezuela case. I can't read the tea leaves. We only have a couple minutes left, but cyber and genocide in Myanmar, I would love to talk about that. Yeah, so I was recently, and I might just go a little over time if those running this could just not cut me off at exactly 12:30. I'll just finish with this last question and then wrap it up. So I've been privileged to serve on the Council of Advisors on the application of the Rome Statute, that's the International Criminal Court Statute, to cyber warfare. And we were looking, and we just recently launched this report and had a launch event through NYU, and we had a UN one as well. We're going to have one in The Hague as well coming up. And I've been on these, and we've been looking at, when are cyber crimes so extreme that they actually amount to genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or aggression. And a report covers all 4 scenarios. The question was about genocide and cyber-enabled genocide. And yes, I do think that what's happening to the Uyghurs, there has been surveillance and tracking. They've hacked into their iPhones to conduct some of their surveillance. So there has been cyber means utilized in tracking them. Now, I say it's a cyber-enabled genocide because there's also rape, forced abortion, removing children from the Uyghur population, forced sterilization, mass imprisonment. So these are, I think, all hallmarks of potentially genocide as well, but not necessarily through cyber. So there's plenty of non-cyber crimes, but that's why I would describe it as a cyber-enabled genocide, that cyber is playing a role. And unfortunately, with new media tools such as Facebook. If I had more time, I'd talk about Myanmar as a potential cyber-enabled genocide with the Facebook posts by the Myanmar military inflaming hostilities against the Rohingya. So we unfortunately have a new potential. Using the media to inflame hostilities isn't new. It was used in Rwanda using RTLM radio, Kangura newspaper. We've seen tensions inflamed in our country as well. Luckily, it hasn't resulted in genocide, I have to knock wood. But unfortunately, with new technology comes new ways to commit these crimes. But I don't want to end on a grim note, because what I'm actually all about is prosecuting the atrocity crimes and prosecuting them through fair trials, but prosecutions. And that's kind of the angle that I'm really looking at. So analyzing the crimes, but before we get too grim, talking about how do we prosecute them with a goal to trying to cut down on the commission of such crimes. So this is kind of the topic of my spring course, and it has been delightful speaking with you today, and I'll end this lecture here. Take care, everyone. Thanks for joining.